All right. Thank you all for coming to our first business and economics talk. We are happy to have Sean Mulholland, who is a professor of economics at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, North Carolina. He has published research articles on a wide variety of topics, including human capital and economic growth, white supremacist groups and hate crimes, school competition and student performance, and Uber and drunk driving. His research has appeared in many peer-reviewed journals. His co-authored paper, Ride Sharing, Fatal Crashes and Crime, was awarded the George Jesko Rogan Prize for the best academic article published in the Southern Economic Journal in 2018. His work has been covered by Ballotopedia, PolitiFact, National Review, and marginalrevolutionuniversity.com. He has been awarded numerous faculty excellence award over the course of his career. He has held faculty positions in Boston College, Stonehill College, and Mercer University. He has guided a dozen undergraduate research projects. He was born and raised in Anderson, South Carolina, got his MA and PhD from Clemson University. He lives in Franklin, North Carolina, with his wife, who's also an economist at Western Carolina University, Angela Dillis. And they have 3 children. And I don't know if any of you were around, Angela Dillis also had spoken at IU East a few years ago. Today, he'll be talking about test optional admissions and student debt. Before he starts, please keep your phone in silent or turn it off. Please join me in welcoming Sean.
Check. Thank you. Thank you, Philip, for a kind introduction and a lengthy narrative on my bio. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to hold this, if that's not. See if that works. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about test optional admissions and student debt. If I was to ask some of the students a little bit about their college application experience, how would you describe it? So it all started with the ACT and SAT and PSAT and college entrance exams galore. What was that like? Stressful, nerve-wracking. These are the words that students oftentimes would use when describing the application experience. And it's one of the reasons why Allie Bevers Thompson now, and I became interested in, how should I do this? Is this going in and out on you guys? Without the mic? All right. So it's one of the reasons why Allie Bevers Thompson and I now began interested in test optional admissions. Test optional admissions has been growing across the country, and we wanted to know kind of what was the effects of these standardized tests. Initially, standardized tests were promoted as a meritocratic way to increase college admissions across the country. Up until the 1950s, most college students applied and attended to schools very close by, and it was sold as a way for students who were applying to schools far away to send some information about their academic preparation, because oftentimes places, mostly these New England schools like Harvard and others who began using these, didn't know anything about the high school of where the students were coming from, And so this was a way for there to assess whether or not the student was prepared. Recently, we've seen more and more research that has led us to some concern about using standardized tests. And much of that is because there's a clear positive correlation between performance and socioeconomic status. And not only that, we've also seen more evidence showing that it is not as strong a predictor of student performance once they do arrive on campus as well. And so these findings led a number of schools to start not using them. And by 2019, before the pandemic, we would see that there was about a new test optional admissions policy announcement about every 10 days by an institution. Of course, since the pandemic, this is accelerated. Now I know IU East is also test optional, as is much of the Indiana University system. And so the question is, what's the effect of going test optional? Well, the other thing that's been growing over time is student debt. And unfortunately, many of you are in the process of taking on this debt. My hope is that the return on that is high enough to pay for it, but there's a concern about what's going on in terms of the debt that people are accumulating. The increase from 2004 to 2016 was a 50% increase in nominal debt load. All right, and so there's been this huge increase in debt over time. And the question is kind of why? And it's not just that debt has gone up. It turns out that debt has gone up in an unequal way. And so, for instance, student debt in majority Black zip codes are now higher and stand at $37,000 per student, which is about $3,000 to $4,000 more than students coming from non-minority zip codes. And so, what Allie Thompson and I basically have a hypothesis is that when schools go and become test optional, and students then choose not to submit their test scores, they send a bit of information. They send some information about the applicant. First of all, it sends some information about the applicant's academic profile, but more importantly, it sends an important bit of information to the institution about the outside options that student has. If you're a student who's applying without submitting your scores, you may have not taken the test, or you may not like the performance on that test. And so you're only able to apply to other schools that also are test optional. And so schools are going to kind of tease out of that a signal that says you may be applying at fewer places. And if you're applying at fewer places, then your demand for my services is more inelastic. That is going to be less responsive to other changes, particularly less responsive to changes in actual tuition or paid tuition. And so that's kind of the hypothesis that we're going down. Now, I like to go ahead and tell you the punchline so that I'm not like keeping you, on your edge of your seat, because this way I can at least talk a little about the punchline and then take you through the process that gets me to the punchline. So what's our punchline? We find that student debt increases about 4 to 6% for those graduates that were admitted under test optional policies versus those graduates that were not. And to be more precise, I'm looking within institutions. So I'm saying that those individuals that say started at Stonehill College in New England pre-test optional, their debt is lower, about 4 to 6% lower than those who were admitted to Stonehill at that same institution under a test optional policy. This is about somewhere between $1,000 to $1,800 more in terms of debt. It holds across a variety of different measures of what we say is test optional. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit this in more detail, but oftentimes an institution will announce that they're test optional, but really they're only test optional under certain specific bits of information about the student. So for instance, you are test optional. You don't have to submit your test scores if your high school GPA was. So we're going to have to talk about different ways in which both institutions and a couple other research articles have measured test optional admissions. And I'm going to use 3 of these different measures to basically say, are our findings robust to these kind of slight differences in definition? The final thing is it also holds across a number of specifications. I'm going to talk about lag and leads. I'm going to talk about different ways that we can go about analyzing whether or not you're going to have institution fixed effects, something that's a non-changing characteristic about the institution, holding that constant versus not, or institution-specific growth effect. So over time, that institution is going to change how they do admissions. If that trend, if I say like, let's get rid of certain trends in terms of how they go about assessing students, does this effect hold in terms of debt? And so various things as I go on. There are kind of three strands of literature here that I'm going to talk about when it comes to talking about standardized test scores, student debt, and market power or pricing by institutions. As I mentioned before, they were sold as kind of a meritocratic way to get students to be able to go and attend institutions across the country. And when you look at kind of the research, they start assessing kind of what's happening to the student composition as they change from a test required to a test optional school. Belasco, Rosinger, and Hearn in 2015 look at whether these test optional policies affect the proportion of low income and minority enrolled students at liberal arts colleges. They find that when you go test optional, they actually enrolled a lower percentage of Pell recipients and underrepresented minority testing at those institutions. So when they went to test optional, they actually reduced, they found a reduction in the minority students that were enrolled. They also find that applications do tend to grow over time. So students respond to this change. And they show that when they look at liberal arts colleges again, they see that there's a rise in the reported SAT scores over time as well. Because what you're doing is now you're getting a selection bias of students, right? The students that aren't reporting are the ones that have the lower SAT scores, but their reported goes up. Now, why is that important? Well, one of the ways in which schools tend to be ranked at things like US News and Report and others is by the entering SAT score, the 25th and 75th percentile. Many of you have seen this in like reported things, right? So what it does is it allows them to report higher SAT scores, even though it's likely that the underlying SAT scores haven't changed by as much, right? So it's a bang, they get a benefit from that on that level. The other thing that we see is Sabo and Teresi, who are in Pennsylvania, they do a difference in difference, much like I do, and find that there's a minimal effect on graduate selectivity, diversity, and performance in school. So they find that there isn't that much effect in terms of overall performance, but if we look at the other paper, we see that there's been a reduction in minority students. Now, what's really fascinating is if you start looking at kind of the socioeconomic differences that are going on here. Nettles in 2003 find that there's almost a 130-point gap on combined SAT scores between African-American students whose parents earn less than 10,000 versus African-American students whose parents earn over 10,000. So for African-American students, there's a huge SAT gap between those two income groups. If you look at whites, it's only a 50-point difference. So there's a huge difference in the performance of African-Americans when I group them by socioeconomic status than whites. And that can have a negative effect in terms of enrollment at institutions. And this is why a lot of these institutions have gone to SAT optional. Let's talk a little about student debt. There's a big debate in the literature of what the consequences of student debt are, and I'll tell you that the strands disagree with each other. There's a large group that say student debt is bad. It reduces future earnings. It reduces the likelihood of buying a house and other kind of investments as after graduation. There's a whole other strand that says no, the debt's actually valuable and these individuals actually earn more. Now, what's fun about those papers is that some of them actually go and look at what kind of occupations they choose, and people who borrow to go to school tend to choose occupations that pay them more. And that, like, for instance, there's a great paper looking at lawyers, students going to law school. Those who borrow are much more likely to go to corporate law firms than, say, nonprofit groups and municipalities and such. So there's a bunch of selection bias going on here when it comes to student debt. One of the things that is fascinating is there's a paper by Craig and Rayson that look at the institutional determinants of American undergraduate debt and the price that they pay. And they find that students interested in lowering their debt levels attend smaller schools in smaller settings and consider going part-time more often. They show that requiring higher standardized test scores on entrance exams is associated with lower debt at graduation. So that's kind of similar to what we're going to find, but in the other way. When you require standardized test scores, you see higher debt. The last little thing is on pricing, and there's two fabulous papers that look at this. Fu in 2013 has a very theoretical paper where he goes and he basically says, when an institution loses information about a student, how do they respond? And they respond by, if they're a selective school, they respond by raising price. And his theory is that, well, if socioeconomic status seems to be correlated with performance, then if you raise price, then you basically price out people lower down the socioeconomic ladder. So a highly selective school raises price when they lose information about students, particularly students' academic preparation. And then Fillmore has this fabulous paper where he looks at how students fill out FAFSA form. Well, everybody filled out a FAFSA form. Yeah, and there's always reminders like you got to fill out the FAFSA form. Well, guess what admissions offices do with FAFSA form? Anybody want to guess? Well, what kind of information do you fill out on the FAFSA form? So income, so there's your socioeconomic status. What else? Here's the other thing you do. You send it to every school you're applying to, right? Because you got to tell them, like, what's my socioeconomic status? Because you want to be eligible for scholarships and loans and grants, right? It turns out that the other institution can see all the institutions that you've applied to. Not only do they know your income or your household income and some of the household wealth measures, they also know where else you've applied. And more importantly, how many other places you've applied. And it turns out that Fillmore found that if you look at FAFSA forms and you look at the number of institutions that somebody has put on that form, they tend to be less responsive, they tend to be more responsive to price. That means the more options you have, the more sensitive you are to price differences across those schools that you've applied to. What's even cooler is Fillmore then goes and figures out that some people fill out the FAFSA form after the admissions period, so in like May, when it goes, and it turns out that those students, there's almost no effect in terms of their behavior. So it's clearly that information that the school is picking up is being used for pricing. So what's the effect? They lose some information about the academic profile. Fu is going to say high quality place is going to raise the price in terms of like academic preparation. Low academic preparation institutions are going to tend to lower their price. So we're going to get this bifurcation. But it also provides some information about, so what's our hypothesis? Our hypothesis is that if you look at selective schools, and we're going to look at those that are in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, either national universities, national liberal arts colleges, regional college, regional universities, we think they're going to see an increase in price and an increase in debt load. How are we going to do that? Well, we have a number of different sources that we're gathering data from. We need information on student debt. And the student debt that we get from the Institute for College Access and Success, they actually get it from the college scorecard. You can actually go out and see what someone who graduates from IU East, like the first year out, what their average debt and median debt is. These data go from about 2003 to 2019. This Institute for College Access and Success has a whole list of other measures that also come from the college scorecard. We're always going to look at graduates' debt, and we're going to be comparing that to their entrance requirements when they enter. The test obstacle admissions comes from one organization called the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. They're an advocate for test obstacle admissions. So they tend to be what I would say really liberal about assessing whether some institution went test obstacle. Some institutions say if you graduate in the top 20% of your class, or 10% of your class, you don't have to submit test scores. If you have a 3.0 in high school, you don't have to submit test scores. They tend to be really liberal, so we follow them in their definition. There have been two recent papers. Bennett just came out in the Journal of Higher Education just last spring, where he goes out and figures out what are the schools actually doing. And he has a definition that says, no, I'm only going to basically categorize them if it is all students are eligible for test obstacle admissions or some large fraction. It's not picking it up at all? Okay.
Thank you. Bennett says, well, you can't be that liberal because some of these institutions, when they go to test optional admissions, it says, well, you know, if you have over a 3.0, well, is that a large fraction of the potential applicant pool? So what Bennett says is, well, if it's over a certain percentage, like 70% of the students actually meet that eligibility, we'll call that test optional since it treats almost all the students as test optional. If it's below that, then he doesn't call it test optional. And DeRose has a slightly different way of defining it. But my main point here is that I wanted to have like 3 different ways to define it to see how robust it is to that definition. Because if it's the actual process of how they go about assessing, that's going to give us one result. If it's simply the announcement, the media publication, the media, you know, coverage they get, and that informational change out in society, then all 3 of these should have some kind of relationship. We also want to control some characteristics of the institution. I have things like total list price, the percent of students with aid, acceptance rate, and the enrollment. Since I'm going to be looking at kind of debt per student, I need to weight more heavily institutions that have more schools so that they have more weight in the estimation. Those come from the NCES or the IPEDS, which a lot of university faculty and staff and administrators are familiar with. And then I only look at institutions that are selective, and I'm using this US News and World Report as the measure of selectivity. Although there are some schools that are open enrolled in there, I wanted to include at least a substantial enough list so we could kind of see if there was much of a difference. So I'm going to show you an equation. I know you guys are excited seeing an equation. This is why you came today. This is my estimation equation, which basically says I want to look at graduate debt, and I want to look at that relative to the test optional admissions policy that was present when they applied. And although we know that not everybody graduates in 4, 5, 6 years, 7, not everybody graduates, I'm only looking at graduates, and I'm only looking at relative to the 4 years after they enrolled. And I recognize that that's not true for a lot, but most of these institutions are traditional schools, and most of the students who do graduate will graduate still in 4 years. And so I'm looking at when the admissions process that was present when they applied relative to their debt when they graduate 4 years later. I'm also going to include something called year fixed effects. So I'm basically saying if there was something unique about, say, 2013, or dare I say 2020, that is affecting either the admissions process or graduate behavior, I can get rid of that change that's taking place because of something unique about that year. So that year fixed effect says, hey, there's something unique about 2020. 2020 is not in here. But if there was something unique about 2020, I can at least get rid of something that's going to affect everybody similarly across 2020. I have something called institution fixed effects. It says, hey, maybe there's something unique about this institution. Maybe there's something unique about Davidson College just outside Charlotte. And maybe there's something kind of about the way they go about assessing students when they apply and about their financial aid. Well, if that seems to be similar across time, then I can get rid of that. That's not going to be able to explain the variation in debt. And then I have an overall time trend, which says, hey, if there's some kind of change that's happening in the nation on a relative kind of basis, I'm taking that account. And then the last one is something called the institution-specific time trend that says, hey, maybe this institution is slowly weighing more heavily some aspect of students' application profile. And if that's causing this change, I'm explaining that away. So I'm trying to get rid of all the variation that could be explaining some of the debt that has nothing to do with test optional, right? Because test optional is bouncing around along with these things. And so I'm trying to get rid of all the variation, smash the variation down so that whatever's left over is something that this test optional may be able to explain. Here's some summary statistics of the variables I'm using. I have the graduate's debt. So the mean graduate debt over this time frame between 2000 to 2015, those are lagged 3 years, was about $28,752. So just under 30, very similar to what I showed you at the very beginning on the graph. It was like 29,000 or something. its minimum average debt is anywhere from $3,000, just under $3,000, to as high as $68,000. These are only private institutions. Now, I chose only private institutions because they're the ones that can independently price college. If you talk to any of the regional universities across the country, they're limited in their ability to affect pricing. They can't affect admissions. I have 3 different measures of test optional, going test optional. About 12% of the observations over that time frame across institutions are test optional. You can see for Bennett it's slightly higher. For DeRose it's slightly lower. Percent receiving aid. I have the acceptance rates everywhere from an acceptance rate of 4%, 4 out of every 100. And then I have the total price range, and that total price range is the listed price. And it includes, it's the in-state price if it was a public school, but since these are all private schools, there's no difference between the in and out. And the year that is here is actually lagged 3 years because that's the test optional T plus 3. All right, so what is this? What I want to do is I want to know what's the change in debt. So what's the percent increase in debt of students admitted under test optional versus those that were admitted under non-test optional or test required. And I'm doing this within institution, right? So, and what I mean is because I have year fixed effects and institutional fixed effects and an overall trend, any change is the kind of difference between graduates that came to that institution before test optional versus after. What's the percentage difference in debt? And when I don't have institution specific effects, trends, and I don't have controls, it's about a 6%. So that 0.059, or call it 0.06, is about a 6% increase in the debt for those that have been admitted under a test optional. As I go across, I'm adding different controls. Remember, I said I'm trying to reduce the variation, right? There's variation going on, and I hit it with a variable and say, like, well, can this variable explain some of the variation? Well, it turns out that institution-specific trends can, right? There's something going on at those institution level for each one of these schools. And so that's going to cause the percent to decline to about 4%. So there's still a 4% increase in student debt post-test optional admissions. I then include controls. Then I include institution-specific trends and controls. This is kind of like everything that I have at the kitchen sink thrown in there. It's still about a 4%. All right, so we see about a 4% increase in debt for students who were admitted under test optional policies. That's the fair test one. Here's just the level, because most students, when I'm talking to them, they're like, well, what is a 6 or 4% change? Like, I want to know how much it is I owe. You can do this also with the level, and you can see it's $1,800. The second one is not statistically significant when we include the institution-specific trends without controls. It's $1,500 or $1,000. So it's somewhere between $1,000 and $1,800, depending upon what the specification here is. So that's what that 4 to 6% increase actually means in terms of dollars. That's the fair test optional measure. If I take the Bennett and do the same performance again, I get a very similar thing, anywhere from about 6% to about 4%. It's pretty, it's not only is it pretty robust, it's pretty stationary relative to what we see with the fair test. Again, I do it for the level, anywhere from about $1,800 to $1,000 as well. That is, these variations in how we kind of define test optional doesn't seem to be changing that dollar value very much, or the percentage change. If I then do it for the DeRose, initially I don't see. So whenever I do not include the institution-specific trends, it seems to not be significant. But once I do, it's anywhere from about, it's really about 5%. Again, so it seems to be pretty consistent across these different measures in terms of the percent increase. The dollar amount, again, is somewhere, you can see at some point it's not significant on this measure. It's about $896, but $897, but without the stars means it's not, I reject that it is different than 0. And the 2 with institution specific trends is positive. Now, there's debate on whether or not choosing that 3-year lag is actually the right thing to do. And so what economists can do and what other social scientists can do is we can do something called an event study. And what we can see is like, well, instead of just having that 3-year difference, let's put in 4, 2, 1. Let's put in 4, 5, 6, 2, 1, 0. So we can look at like what 1-year lag, 2-year lag, 3-year lag, 4-year lag, what those differences, which one of those explains the differences in debt. Maybe I chose the wrong, maybe most students graduate in 4 years. It should have been a 4, not a 3. Right. So what I can do is I can do a robustness check that says like, I keep doing this test optional relative to 3 years. Maybe I should do it 2 years or 1 year. And so I create one where I have all these different leads before the actual student graduates. And what you'll find is there's something unique about that year, that the 3 years difference or 4 years. There's something unique about that admissions policy in that year that's affecting debt. And each one of those is positive. And this one, they always seem to be around 6 to 7%. But the point is, I'm trying to figure out if what I'm actually seeing is what's taking place, right? So I'm trying to figure out, is a 3-year lag the right lag? It seems to be. And it also shows that there's not some kind of like either echo, that was sweet, or if there's some kind of like initial response, like we hear that it might happen. Most of the time, these announcements take place at the beginning of the admissions cycle, but not always. And so there's also a concern that if I was to get like statistically significant results in some year before or year after, particularly year before, that what I was actually picking up isn't actually the change in test optional admission, it's something else. And so we want to kind of make sure that what I'm actually observing has to do with that 3rd year. The other robustness check that I want to do is I want to see like, well, there might be something unique about places that go test optional. And although I've got institution-specific fixed effects and I've got institution-specific trends, maybe there's something about those places. There's just something about places that ultimately go that way. And so I can create a subsample of schools that are just ones that ever go test optional. And so like, well, what do I still see it? If I just look at those that go test optional, do I see something? And so this is basically if over any time between 2000 and 2015, or it's really 2003 and 2018, if any time over that time period, a school ever goes test optional, they're still in the sample. So I'm getting rid of all the ones that don't, which is the ones I'm basically comparing the ones that do with. And you can see that in 3 of the 4 specifications, when I look at just ever test optional, I'm still getting something between about 4 and 6%, except for the last one. So now I've got like just ever test optional and all the controls, and it goes and becomes, it's not statistically significant, right? So I'm throwing a lot, I'm smashing all that variation by as much as I can. And when I do enough of it, there's just not enough left for me to be able to explain it. So what's the point of today's talk? The point of today's talk is it looks like when schools go test optional, there's an increase in the graduate's debt by about 4 to 6%. That amounts to somewhere between $1,000 and $1,800. It's robust across those different definitions of test optional, and it's robust to a number of different ways of analyzing it in terms of statistical analysis. So it looks like there's something there. Now, here's the caveat. A, it's a working paper, so we still have a little bit more to do on it. B, we've just lived through a time where a large fraction of institutions switched. As you increase the number of institutions that switch, you're likely, each institution is less able to use that information to price. Because if all of your options are test optional, then you no longer kind of have a limit. The student can still then now go back and respond by price, because test optional admissions is not something on which you might make your decision. So what's the punchline? I think what's going to happen, and we've got 1 or 2 things we want to do. I think what's going to happen is this likely will go away as more and more institutions become test optional. This was something that was kind of unique to the time, assuming schools then don't go back and start requiring it again. And it'll be fascinating to see how we do that. But I know that the enrollment that's taking place is consistent with the story, Fu's story, which is a lot of schools that are kind of viewed as higher status and have a higher standard of admissions. Even when they got rid of test optional, they saw a huge increase in their applicants. I know this is what you guys witnessed in Indiana. And those that traditionally had lower SAT standards for admission that got rid of them actually saw a reduction in applicants. So again, you see the bifurcation, which Fu is kind of trying to explain, but in a new environment that we're living in. So with that, this is the end of my talk, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have and continue this further into the day. So thank you very much for listening to me and being here today. And I look forward to any questions you may have. So thank you. Yes. You mean as I move toward one? Is that what you meant? Yeah. Well, I mean, more and more schools are, have been over time, have been more heavily weighting things like your high school grade point average and the courses that you take. For a lot of small, like liberal arts colleges who have fewer applicants to review, they tend to look at a number of other things that you're involved in: student government, athletics, music, performance, right? And so they tend to try to match that to their class. The big institutions, I think, public institutions may go kind of the way Texas has, which is if you're in a certain fraction of your class, you're automatically admitted to this school and things of that nature. The question I have is if they're actually going to stay that way. I'm wondering what's going to happen in terms of schools going back to requiring entrance exams. It'll be fascinating. I don't know. I do know that when you look at some schools held on to them. There's a big debate of why certain institutions held on to test requirements. Because the reason kind of told was, well, it was hard to get to a testing center. They were closed. There were all these things, right? Well, as that goes away, how many of them are going to shift back? But it is fascinating when you look at the research literature, because they really poorly predict performance, and they actually underpredict performance of minority students. So that is, if I look at a student who made a 900 on SAT, the African-American student actually is more likely to perform better. The African-American student with a 900 SAT is more likely to perform better than the white student with a 900 SAT. That is, it actually, the prediction's actually poorer, because that's what you're wanting, right? You want, like, how successful will this student be here given the demands? And so I don't know. I think that there will be something, but it'll be fascinating to see what direction, but I don't know. I don't. I've seen one paper that has to do a lot with language exposure at certain ages, but that's the only paper I'm familiar with, and it's not something I've dug into. But it seems to be pretty consistent, right? So this is what's fascinating about, like, these debates. Like, there've been a lot of discussion that says, hey, due to socioeconomic reasons, people are harmed on these, right? But what's fascinating to me is the fact that, like, if I have two students with the same score, based on, and I look at their race, they actually underpredict. The prediction is less valid for the African-American student, particularly. They perform above what the expectation is. And so, you get in these debates of, like, well, should the entrance exam standards be the same or different? And it's like, well, there's an argument that they should be different, because it says, actually someone that scored an 870 that's African-American is going to perform similar to a white student that's at 900. There's some literature on the peer effects, and that is you're kind of resetting the peer effects, right? So there are peer effects where you went to high school, and there's a lot of function based on where you can afford to live. You reset them, you throw them to college, all right? So you've jumbled them. but you get peer effects there. And so if there's peer effects there, that now you're with people who are slightly better prepared, you actually converge to them. So there's a peer effects literature, and my wife, who's also an economist, will know this better than I. But so this is more me like, having dinner conversation with you. but that might be something that's explaining that difference too. Yeah. Bill. Well, I mean, you can. So I don't know about this recent change, but you can't. There's clearly data on admission staff relative to applicants at liberal arts colleges. There's way more per applicant, and that's because they're assessing them more thoroughly, right? That is, a great example of this is at a lot of regional state schools. You hit these thresholds, you're in, done. It's almost, you don't need anybody. You could just basically like enter it into a keyboard and you're admitted. And they have to only look at that kind of we call the marginal case, the cases on the border. But in liberal arts colleges, they're reading all of those. So they definitely have more admissions people per applicant. I thought you were going to say like that really what this is the admissions counselors association says, hey, we need to get rid of these. Is that where you're going? Yeah. We need to get rid of those because they're horrible. And you'll have to hire like 3 or 4 of us for each institution. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. That's hilarious. Yeah. It's the Sarbanes-Oxley for admissions. Sarbanes-Oxley, sorry, inside joke. Sarbanes-Oxley is an accounting, it's an oversight regulation that basically increased potential punishment for failing to uphold certain accounting and financial principles, I guess is the best way of saying it. And so a lot of places went and hired more accountants in response. And so this is why I blame all the accountants get paid more than economists, right? No, just kidding. They do a good work. Yes. Right. So yeah, the negative sells, but I like your story. No, you should take a test and should only apply to places that require the test. At which point your debt would likely be lower because your price sensitive, you'd still have the price sensitivity. Yeah. Right. You'd be closer to, yeah, that's right. That's the So what you're making argument of, this is the argument that people who like standardized tests want to say, right? Like, well, you should go and take the test and then only apply to places that require it. So yeah, I hadn't thought about looking at like GRE, GMAT, LSAT. Yeah. Yeah, and the traditional MBA. Oh, okay. So you're right, because you're reducing in some sense, you've reduced potential competition. Students who may have otherwise done okay didn't take. Yeah. 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 So the term, I guess, would be like a market segmentation, right? Um, yeah, I think that. Well, I mean, and that's consistent with what Fu finds. Basically, like higher, more selective actually raised well, they raised the tuition because that was the way they kind of selected who would perform as well. But you're now saying they can't because they've generated enough revenue through volume over here, and they've raised their standard enough over here to where the dollar amount the revenue they're still bringing in, they're basically treating them as two totally different goals. Yeah, you could do that. I don't know if you could do that at an undergraduate level at a particular school. That would be fascinating. At the graduate level, I think you can. Yeah. Well, I think you're going to see more and more of that as states give less revenue, period. Um, Institutions are just going to say, like, you can call us a state school or a university, but if you'll give us the flexibility, we won't need any more revenue. I mean, a number of schools, I mean, UVA is kind of almost at that point. It's below like 8% or something crazy in terms of its state support. Yep. So I, you're right. Over the entire years of observation, there's a number of them. Bard's one. I think Bowdoin's another. I want to say there's like, I think Bates might be. There's about 10 of them. Yeah. Yeah. And I suspect that initially it was like a market niche. And then I think they realized that it gave them a little more pricing power. Um, I'm not comparing like because they don't change. In some sense, that's not the variation I'm even investigating. But it would be fascinating to kind of um, look at acceptance rates over time at them just to see kind of what's going on. But you're right. I can't really, because I'm relying on that change, I can't really go and see um, what is taking place there. Is that what you were wanting? You, well, right. I mean, so what I think we could do potentially is if I could go and find what was required for admissions pre this big event that started changing, say in mid 2000s, what did they require? Like what was asked of the student? So that you could see kind of what were they assessing and how are they assessing? And to also, because they were so selective to begin with, they may already have had the pricing power. So that wasn't their motivation, right? But but you're right. In my kind of story, they're kind of always one, right? They're always, I don't get any variation. But you're right in kind of investigating why they went that way. Would be good to add some narrative in here. We can talk more at lunch. And I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards too, if you'd like, one-on-one.